Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Chitra here, and I'm from the CNAI Central Accessibility team, one of the senior program manager here. I have Sean Merrihew here from the CELA organization. He's from the CELA Accessibility team today. He's going to present and cover a topic for the webinar. And today's topic is about creating accessible content in Word and PowerPoint. The format of the webinar is going to be an hour long, and the last 15 minutes we will go ahead and take any questions you have. So continue posting all your questions in the Q&A window here, and I'll surface them towards the end. With that said, let's kickstart the webinar. Sean, over to you. Thanks.
Sounds good. Thank you, Chitra, and good morning, everyone. Thanks to those of you who have joined so far. So as Chitra mentioned, I am going to cover some tips on creating accessible content, mostly focused on Word and PowerPoint, but whenever possible, I'll try to bring it out to other products too, like Outlook, some of our online offerings, and even tools like Accessibility Insights I'll briefly tee up near the end. And so again, this is really all just to cover some of the basics of what you can do to make your content more consumable for people with disabilities. But also there's a lot of great practices that while it's better from an accessibility perspective, it's also just better for everyone consuming your content. So I'll try to call out some of those examples as well. So just to give you an idea of what we'll run through today, so I'll talk a little bit about what accessibility really means, why it's such an important topic, and then I'll cover in the main portion, I'll do several demos, and like I have a sample document and sample slides that we'll kind of work through, and I'll just show you how to do a lot of these things on this list. But we'll first start by looking at what the accessibility checker is able to do. I'll talk more about that shortly. And then there's a few things that the tool isn't able to check for automatically, but some other recommendations that we'd still have. There's an option in Outlook for you to request accessible content. So it shows up as a reminder for anyone who's sending you content that they know you'd prefer it be in an accessible format. And then, as I mentioned, I'll briefly touch on accessibility insights before we get into some Q&A. So let's go ahead and jump right in. So I'm just going to be kind of working through this slide and chipping away at each of the bullet points here. And so when we're talking about accessibility, we often reference the number that 1 in 5 people in the world has a disability. And now disability is a spectrum. There's just a wide range of disability and how it can impact folks. But when we think about designing content that is accessible and meets the needs of those 1 in 5 people, it's also a great experience for everyone. But when we think about delivering content to customers or stakeholders, with that same figure, let's imagine that 1 in 5 of our stakeholders, 1 in 5 of our customers has a disability. If we're not designing things and content and information and websites and apps that don't meet their needs, we run the risk of excluding people. And so accessibility is all about inclusion and just building some of those systems and tools for helping you understand the best practices and how to deliver on accessibility. So I'm going to switch over to my sample document that I've created today. Let me just change my office theme. So I've created this document on the Amazon rainforest. Just to give you an idea of what's in here, there's a table that has some information about what percentage of the Amazon rainforest is in each South American country, some information on deforestation, a few images, some content on why all this matters, and then what folks can do to get involved. And then I have my bibliography down at the very end. So that's just a high-level overview of what's in the document. So I mentioned the accessibility checker. So that's a feature in Office that basically runs a set of automated checks against your content and returns several results. So there's a few ways to find this. If you've used it for a long time, you may know that it's in File, Info, Check for Issues, and then Check Accessibility. But since it was introduced there, it's now a lot more discoverable in a couple other spots too. So now in the Review tab, there is just a button right there for Check Accessibility. So that's another way to get to it. So that, again, it's all about just making it even more discoverable. In the next area I want to show is down in the status bar, which is the lower left corner of the window. It has things like page numbers, word count, etc. You may notice that there's an item that says Accessibility Recommendations Found. Check here to investigate. So now that's even made it even more discoverable. So as I add content, the status of that little icon will change. And I can just activate it right away to open the accessibility checker. So let's go ahead and do that. Cool. So we now have our accessibility checker results organized in a few different ways. So you'll notice that there's errors, things that the tool is able to tell are definitely issues and things we should fix. And then there's some warnings that are some other best practices. And then as I work through this, we'll see a couple other categories of issues come up as we work through these items. So first, I did want to start and talk a little bit about text contrast. So you may notice in this deforestation section here, I have some text that I have intentionally made that very hard to read, just as kind of an exaggerated example. But I have some text here that's black text with a dark blue highlight. So it's pretty hard to read. And the tool flags that as having a color contrast issue. Now, this is an exaggerated example, but I do often see in lots of documents and content that authors use text color and highlights that are really similar. And so for a user who's maybe low vision, it's a lot more difficult to differentiate that text from the background. And in this example, it's just very difficult for everyone because it's such a, there's not very much contrast there. So the accessibility checker now lets you fix these things inline. So let's go ahead and just expand each of these and see what we can do. So this, if I select it, it selects the text for me. You may notice that there's a drop down in that list as well. So if I select the drop down, it gives me the recommended actions I can take just right away. So I can change the font color, or I can change my text highlight color. In this case, I think the usual intent of a highlight is just giving the text a highlight color. So let's go ahead and change the highlight from black. Let's maybe do yellow. That's pretty common. And as I change that, you'll notice that the error is now cleared out of the list. So that's one down. As I talk about this, I'll also reference some of the best practices I mentioned earlier. One of the things that's really common is in emails especially, and so this is where I'll get into Outlook and other apps a little bit. When you highlight some text, it's often good to indicate that information with more than just the color alone. And so in accessibility, that's generally referred to using color alone to convey information. And so oftentimes when you're highlighting something or putting a comment inline in an email, you're using things like see inline. And if you're using only color, so only a highlight to indicate that, it can get a little bit lost. So if you want to make sure that people see this, you'd select the text, and maybe one other option is to use an underline here. I have a cat in my face today. So using an underline is just another way that adds some extra context on how to differentiate this information. One other option is if you're using lots of inline comments and emails, in addition to the color, using your initials or the date is another good way to indicate it. I mean, this is a document here, but I'll just give you an example. I think I just got today's date wrong, but let's say that I decided to do that, where I put my name, my initials, and the date to indicate my comment. So now I'm conveying that I want to call attention to that item in more than just color. So those are always good things to keep in mind. So moving along here, so I mentioned that this document has a couple images in it. So under my deforestation heading, and right before the Why It Matters section, I have a photo I've put in here that's a waterfall falling off of a cliff, and it's kind of surrounded by jungle. And so when we're thinking about images, generally there's a couple different types. There's things that we're really intending to convey content. In this case, our subject matter is all about the Amazon rainforest, and so maybe this sort of photo of something in the jungle is very indicative of that environment, and so maybe I'd want to keep that here. When we're thinking about images, it's important that people be able to consume those. And so oftentimes we refer to what's called alternative text for images. And that's just really, so let's show you what that looks like. So when I select one of these errors, my cat gets out of the way here. Let's select one of the errors here. So picture one, it says missing alternative text. And so alternative text is basically a quick description of the image that captures the key takeaway. And so for someone who's blind or low vision or is using an assistive technology, that technology would read out the description of the image when they encounter it. So similar to how a sighted user might kind of glance through the email, see the image, and kind of get the takeaway of what the image is conveying. Alt text is a way of conveying that to people with disabilities as well. So there's a couple things we can do here. So I'll just expand this drop down and we can take a look at some of the options that are available. So we can either add our own description where we type it out. We can mark it as decorative. I'll talk about that in a minute. And then there's these other two options. One of them is learn more, and then suggest a description for me. So this is a cool new feature that sends the image to a computer vision service that does its best guess at describing what the image is. So this is a great starting point. Oftentimes these do pretty well at capturing the intent of the image. So let's give that a try. So I'm going to tell it to suggest a description here. So a couple things happened. In my accessibility checker results under errors, I have one fewer error on missing alternative text. And then I have this new category on intelligent services. And it tells me that there's some suggested alt text in my document. The reason it tells us this is just as an extra step to validate that description is really correct. So let's go ahead and check that. So verify description. So it says a large waterfall in a forest. And you'll notice that it says description automatically generated. Again, just indicating that this was generated online. Given my subject matter here, I'm talking about the Amazon rainforest, maybe we should make this a little bit more specific. So a large waterfall falling off a cliff in a jungle. And so I've added just a little bit more context for someone to really see why I've had this specific image in here, as opposed to the description that it suggested was a waterfall in a forest. That could kind of be anywhere. And so if someone who's using an assistive technology is consuming this document, they may be confused about why exactly that's in there. So that extra layer of specificity helps here. Just for fun, there is an option here that's donate your picture for science, and it helps kind of train the image recognition models. So I can say yes, and that'll upload my image. And the confirmation that says here is your contribution will make it easier for us to describe images for blind or low vision users. There's one more image in our document, so let's take a look at that. So in this case, I have this section on here's some ways to get involved. And there's 5 different options here. And there's this image here. So my last bullet point is donate to the World Wildlife Fund. And then right below that, I have an image of the World Wildlife Fund logo. So now we're getting into some of the nuance of images. So because I've just called out the World Wildlife Fund, this image, one could argue, isn't adding any informative content because the content that it's adding is kind of covered right above it. One option is we could mark the alternative text just World Wildlife Fund logo. But when we think about the experience of someone who's using an assistive technology, they might hear out bullet number 5, donate to the World Wildlife Fund. And the next thing we hear is World Wildlife Fund logo. So maybe that's just not the most useful piece of information here. So that's that other option in the recommended actions dropdown I covered. So mark as decorative. So let's do that. And that'll just basically treat it as an invisible object that's not conveying content, just to avoid giving someone kind of too much kind of redundant information. So let's mark it as decorative. And great, now our images and alt text are gone from this list. While we're on the subject of images, there's one more thing that's calling out here. Images or objects not inline. Let's take a look at that and see what that's pointing to. So that takes us back to our first image. And in the accessibility checker, again, it gives us kind of this why fix and steps to fix. So it's saying that if the image or object is not inline, it may be difficult for screen reader or assistive technology users to find it in your document, and can make it a little harder to interact with. Usually the easiest fix here is to always use the inline text wrapping. So in my image, I've just opened the layout options. I can also go to the picture format tab of the ribbon and choose my text wrapping options there. So let's mark it as inline with text. Great, and that's one more error down. While we're still talking about that, I do want to mention another tidbit of information. So while inline is generally the recommended and better option for accessibility, there may be scenarios where another text wrapping option does suit your document better. Maybe if there's columns or things like that. If that's the case, some of these other text wrapping options can work as long as there's a couple other steps you take. So let's do square text wrapping, for example. So some of these other text wrapping options just give us a little bit more flexibility in how that image is placed. So again, we have that error again about the image or object not being inline. You may notice that there's an anchor icon in the left margin of my document alongside the image. That's a solution that can improve the accessibility of these other text wrapping options. The anchor basically indicates where in your document the image should be read. And that way it does get discovered by assistive technology, so a user would find it. And I can basically click and drag that anchor to wherever I want it. So maybe I had wanted this image to be talking about why the Amazon rainforest matters. So I can drag it down, and now that means that the image will be read out to a user right around the same time they are reading all that information. That said, the inline text wrapping is the best option, so we'd recommend that wherever possible. Great, so one more down. So we have one more error and one more warning here. Our error looks like it's in the table that's up above. So I have included this table that is basically a percentage of the Amazon rainforest contained in South American countries. So Brazil has almost 60%, Colombia about 7%, Argentina and Chile at 0%. So they don't have any of the Amazon rainforest in their borders. So this error is calling out that my table doesn't have a header row. And so it looks like it does. I have my country header and my percentage of Amazon rainforest header, but it's not quite there. This error is referring to the kind of the semantic structure of it. And so an assistive technology basically looks at the markup or the semantic structure of the table to convey certain relationships, such that if a user is moving between columns, they would get the appropriate row or column header read out. So it's always good to add a header row to a table. So let's go ahead and do that. So I will select my table. I can either mark it as a layout table that's intended to lay out content. So that's, I think, a fairly new feature, actually. And then the main option here is use first row as header. When in a data table, that's usually the most common approach, that the column headers are at the very first row. And so we can just make that change inline. And again, so there's no visual change to that, but it does make the markup just a little more clear for someone using assistive technology to read through it. There's also, I can also do that manually in the table design tab of the ribbon. When I have the table selected, I'd be able to select that first row and check header row here, and any other information I'd like to convey in that table, I can check appropriately. The critical one is just making sure you have that header row marked. So now we have a warning here about merged or split cells in the table. So I made a couple edits to this table when I was building it that I intended to make it a little easier to consume, but it does make the table structure slightly more complex. And why that's problematic is when someone's using an assistive technology, they would be navigating up or down in the column and then bouncing between columns. So let's say I've gone through the first 5 rows of the table, and the format is, okay, I get my country, and then to the right of it, I get the percentage, country percentage. I get down here, I'm on Guyana, and then I move over to the next cell and I get French Guiana. So that's a little confusing because someone was expecting to get a percentage there and might be wondering why that structure is a little funky. So let's go ahead and change that. So I had intentionally grouped these on the same line, but let's separate them out. So I'm just getting rid of the text in those. I've added my second row, and then I'm going to use the merge column feature. Great, and as I work through that, you may have noticed that in the accessibility checker, those errors slowly went away. So great, so that's one more error down, and then it's telling us that this cell that has the 0% in it is another merged cell, which can impact the experience for someone with a disability. So we recommend just having unique lines for each row in the table. So let's go ahead and split that cell. Let's turn it into 2 rows. Now I've added my 0% in Argentina as well as Chile now. Cool, and you may now notice that back in the accessibility checker, it says no accessibility issues found. People shouldn't have issues reading this document. While we're on the subject, I want to just briefly touch on another best practice. There are another couple best practices in here. So back to my agenda slide, there's one on heading structure. I did already cover conveying information by color alone, but let's take a look at hyperlinks, and then we'll do a couple things in PowerPoint. So in this document, I have some links here. So I have this one that says click here, and under my deforestation heading, I have another link that says click here. So using an assistive technology, a user may get confused by that. The way a link would be read like that is it would just read link, click here. And so it would read link, click here, and then link, click here. So it's difficult for a user to differentiate what those links are pointing to. So let's give them a more descriptive name. And I think my hyperlink went to wikipedia.org. Let me just copy that. So let me craft a new sentence and we can try it out, and then I can get rid of that one. So now I made a new sentence that reads, check out the link Wikipedia article on the Amazon rainforest to learn more. And so I said the word link in there just to indicate how an assistive technology would read it. So when we use that kind of descriptive link, that's very clear. A user knows right away where it's supposed to take them and doesn't have to guess. So let's go ahead and remove that previous sentence. So that's better. So let me again copy hyperlink, and let's do the same thing down here. This is my section on deforestation. Formatting got a little bit messed up. Let me fix that real quick. So now I've added visit this page for more more statistics on deforestation. So not only are the links themselves more descriptive and a user knows where they're going to go, if someone's navigating link to link, they now know which is which. So that's the other important factor there. So next, I mentioned I was going to cover headings. And so in this document, it's broken out into sections. So the very beginning, I have a document title, the Amazon rainforest. Then I have a heading for deforestation, why it matters, and so what you can do. But for those of you who are word power users, you may know that when you add true heading styles from the styles section of the ribbon, they can look a certain way, but they also get added to the navigation pane. So you may notice that I have one item in the navigation pane, a bibliography. When I select that in the Styles tab of the ribbon, it's using a heading 1 style. So headings are really important for conveying the structure of your document. And let's go ahead and add some headings to the document, or at least add some heading styles, because I already have where my section headers are. So with this first one, the Amazon rainforest, let me select that. I'll mark that as a heading level 1. It now shows up in the navigation pane. It adds some other heading features, such as being able to expand or collapse headings. And then, so the way headings work is they're in sections. So my heading 1 indicates the start of the content, or kind of the main area of my content. So heading 1 is always kind of about the main body. Within that main body, I have section headings. So within the body, I would make all of my section headings a heading 2. So deforestation and why it matters would both be heading 2 because they're subsections of the heading 1. In this why it matters section, and then I have one more here. So what can you do? We also make that a heading 2. And as I do that, these get added to the navigation pane. And I have one more here. Here are some ideas. So in the heading 2 of what you can do, there's a section on some specific ideas. So I would say that that's a subsection of what can you do? So let me mark that as a heading 3. And so you kind of see my heading structure get built out a little bit. And so for someone who's using an assistive technology, they're able to navigate just by headings. And so using a clean heading structure like this that is indicating the layout of the content gives them some idea of how best they can most efficiently read through my content. And it's always a good practice to only have one heading 1. There's a couple exceptions to that, but let's say in this document, for example, that makes the most sense. So let's select our bibliography and mark it a heading 2. And so now everything in the document is a subsection of the main body. And again, I can expand or collapse these. So they're a really cool way to clean up if I have a really long document. You may notice that the headings weren't indicated in the accessibility checker. Today, I think the only error that the accessibility checker flags I think it's a tip. That's just kind of a recommendation, is if you have a really long document, like over 10 pages, I'm not sure what the exact rule of thumb is, but when you have really long documents, it's going to recommend that you add headings to make it more easier to consume that document. So that's one example of something that we didn't cover, but would show up in the accessibility checker in some scenarios. Back to my status bar in the lower left, we now have this icon that says accessibility good to go. So now that we've done a lot of these, fixed the accessibility checker errors and warnings and tips, and done some of these other best practices, that's telling us that our document should be a good experience for users. So great, we made some good progress on that Word document. Let's switch back over to PowerPoint. And so I have this PowerPoint open, so let me close out of it. There's a couple things I want to call out here. Well, a lot of the things that I covered in Word pretty much apply one-to-one to Outlook. There's some exceptions to that. There's some nuances to the format that PowerPoint is that makes it a little bit different. As opposed to how the sequence in which someone reads a document, it is very linear. The document is read top to bottom, but someone can navigate section by section. But at the core of it, you don't have to do anything special to control the reading order other than just put the content in the sequence that you want. PowerPoint's a little bit different. There is this idea of slide reading order in PowerPoint. And so let's take a look at that. So I'm going to open up the accessibility checker in PowerPoint. You can access the same 3 ways, either the review tab, the item in the status bar, or under file info. And so I have 2 errors called out in this slideshow. So this slide is telling me I should check my slide reading order. So let's go ahead and try that. Let's verify the object order. So this, the way that this slide would be read is picture 5, and then the alt text, which is something about a woman with illustrated question marks above her to indicate ideas, and then a text box with the text questions. So this reading order pane shows the sequence in which someone's going to consume that. This is a pretty simple slide, but imagine a pretty complex slide where the important information is kind of read out of order. So in this case, the visual order that maybe a sighted user would see in this slide is they would be drawn to the text that says questions, and then they would see the image as kind of a supplemental piece. So by that logic, our reading order is just a little bit backwards here. The text box should be read first, and then the picture should be read second. So we can just click and drag that order, or we can use the up and down arrows there to up and down buttons to move those. Great, so that changed our reading order, and that reading order issue got cleared off of the slide because it knows I went in and validated the reading order that was already there. The next error that it's calling out is a missing slide title. So that's a really similar idea to headings in Word, but a little bit different. So in PowerPoint, I have some slide titles here. If I go to my reading order pane, I can show you those. So this one is title text box 1, and then the text of it on my next slide agenda. I have a title text box that says agenda in it. And then my heading here is a text box that says thank you. And so when someone's navigating through the list of slides, the slide title is the first thing that's read. So I would hear things like slide 2, agenda. On this slide, it would just say slide 4 because on my question slide, it would just say slide 4 because I haven't defined a title text box. So let's go ahead and fix that. So in this case, it's just a text box that says questions. So let's switch back to the accessibility checker. It'll select that object. When I selected it, it switched us to outline view. And in outline view, under each slide, you get kind of the text on the slide. But at the top level, you get the slide title. So this slide looks blank because there's no slide title applied. Again, as someone's reading through, they would hear slide 1 and the slide title, slide 2 and the slide title, and then down in slide 4, it would just hear slide 4. So let's apply a title. It selected the first object on my slide and asked me, do I want to make that the slide title? Do I want to add my own slide title? Or do I want to add a hidden slide title? I'll talk about these in a little bit of detail. Starting with the bottom one, add a hidden slide title. So some slides, there's not really a natural title per se that would show visually. For example, if there's a page with several visualizations or things like that, or a process diagram, maybe we don't want a visual title text box because that could distract from what we're trying to convey. So if I add a hidden slide title, it'll basically just add a text box just off of the slide that won't show, that lets me add a slide title. Because it's adding an object, the accessibility checker did ask us to validate the reading order again. So that's one option. Again, if I type questions here, that covers the slide title. However, even though it's appearing off screen, the title that I've now applied would still be read by assistive technology. So someone would be getting that information twice. And so this option is good if there's not really a logical spot for a title on a slide, but you still want to add one because it does make it a better experience. The other one is add a slide title, which basically just adds a title text box and back to the slide layout and lets me add text to it. There's also set as slide title. So let's do that. So that makes it even easier. I don't have to add anything. I can just select the existing text box and say, make that a title. So now in my outline view, my slide title shows up. And so now when someone lands on this slide, they would hear slide 4, questions. My accessibility checker says there's no more issues. And my reading order pane is good to go. My title is first, and then the image is second. One other thing that I'll mention is if I add my own slide here, let's say I want to just add a slide with resources. I'm going to insert a couple shapes just to do a really quick demonstration here. So I've added just some random stuff. I have a header, a slide title, an arrow, and another text box. If I switch back to my accessibility checker, it's telling me I need to add all text to that. So let me do that real quick. That I'll mark as decorative, that arrow there. So let's say I got rid of my slide title text box altogether. And let me just add one more text box here. So again, I caused an issue with my slide title, so let me fix that. But I now have this issue with check reading order again. So when I create my own custom slides like that, when I add information to the slide, they're basically added in the order. The reading order is based on the order by which those objects were added to the slide. So I've added that resources text box last. And so because I didn't use a built-in layout, it does make me validate the reading order anyway. So as you can see, it's made the title the last object because that was the last edited or the last added object when it converted from a text box to a title field. So I do have to do some extra steps if I use a custom layout. If I use a predefined layout, such as this to-content layout, delete that slide and re-add it. So let me do a new slide, layout, to-content, so I can add resources, then I can add that same image here and that text here. The built-in slide layouts just automatically define my reading order for me. So I don't have to do anything extra there, unless I drastically want things to be read in a different order. So there's a couple recommendations on the accessibility checker and reading order in PowerPoint. Similar idea, but a couple just nuances there that are unique to PowerPoint. So switching back to my agenda slide, I want to quickly cover a couple other things. In Outlook, I can select Prefer Accessible Content. And so I'll show you what that looks like here. Let me draft an email to my colleague Larry, who I know has configured this. He had configured it yesterday, at least. Let me try that again. Okay, well, I'm getting an error message that says can't show mail tips right now. So there goes that demo. But what mail tips are referring to are these messages right above your like send and from and to controls in Outlook. And so you may have noticed things like someone being out of the office, that's usually considered a mail tip. If someone's outside of your organization, there's another mail tip that'll show there. If I've added some inaccessible content, and Larry has said he prefers accessible content, this status bar or the mail tip would show up that says one of the recipients prefers accessible content, and it gives a call to action on how to fix that. So that's a good way to make sure you're receiving accessible content. To set that up, you do need to go into Outlook on the web, and so I have that open here. So I'm going into Settings, View All Settings, General, Accessibility, and then I've already had it checked, but ask senders to send content that's accessible. And again, so now if someone's sending to me something inaccessible, they would be prompted to make it accessible. It doesn't identify the specific users. That's an intended behavior, and I think due to privacy, we don't want to say that a specific user prefers accessible content because that can imply that they maybe have a disability. But it would show up if there's multiple recipients. It may be clear. It's still useful to know that info, I guess. So just to show a couple resources real quick, there's several help articles on the accessibility checker, such as how to use it, and then there are some specific articles for each application, even broken out by platform. So there may be some slight differences in how the accessibility checker works in Word Online versus Word on the desktop, and there's dedicated articles for that. And all of that's on our Office Accessibility Center. And so that's aka.ms/Office Accessibility. I'll show those links in a minute. And I have this section on make your content accessible to everyone. There's some videos, some stuff about each platform. And then I have articles specific to each application and platform. So Sway on the web may have some different behaviors with the accessibility checker than Word. So definitely recommend checking that out. Similar to the accessibility checker is a tool called Accessibility Insights. And it's a tool that's able to look at web content and return some accessibility issues that are found. Similar idea, but it's looking at some web accessibility standards and is comparing the experience against those standards. They have a web extension, so I'll show that in a second. They also have an app for checking Android apps for accessibility, and then for checking Windows apps for accessibility. Well, let me show you what that Accessibility Insights looks like. So I've opened a page from the W3C World Wide Web Consortium. They kind of set a lot of the standards and all that for the web. So let's run a quick check here and see if any issues come up. So I now have my Accessibility Insights icon in my extensions area of my web browser. It looks like a little shield with a magnifying glass icon. So let me select FastPass. That's going to do a quick automated check. And it's looking at the page. And it's going to tell me where there are issues. So in this case, there is one issue. There's a link on their page that doesn't have a name, and it shows you that object on the page. So this is useful if you're creating a lot of web content or you're a web developer or things like that, just to keep a tool to keep in your back pocket. Similar to the accessibility checker, it doesn't catch all possible issues, but it is a really good starting point to get an idea of where your accessibility is at. So this is one that we'd recommend that they fix on their site. So that's Accessibility Insights. With that, I want to wrap up and just share a couple of those links again. First, our accessibility team has a Twitter, MSFT Enable, if you want to follow us and learn more. There's one of the areas I mentioned, the Office Accessibility Center was aka.ms/office accessibility. And then we also have Accessibility Fundamentals, which is a program on docs.microsoft.com where you can learn some of the basics of accessibility. There's a few different modules, and you can get a badge that you're able to display on your social media, such as LinkedIn. We'd strongly recommend doing that, and the link for that is aka.ms/accessibility fundamentals. And I'm part of our Enterprise Disability Answer Desk, which supports enterprise customers that have accessibility questions. So governments and banks and other businesses and things like that. So we work a lot with customers. So if you want to learn more about that, and if you are in a role that interfaces a lot with customers, you may want to reach out and just kind of get to know us and see how we can help. You can learn more at aka.ms/EDAD for the Enterprise Disability Answer Desk. With that, I think we have some time for some questions from you all.
Hey, Sean.
Yeah.
We have a few questions, so I'm going to get started. This question was from David. I'm surprised Accessibility Checker doesn't flag learn more and other ambiguous hyperlinks as such a big case in documents. It's such a big case in documents.
Yeah, that's a valid point. So a while back, there used to be a rule in the Accessibility Checker that would flag link purpose, and it was kind of if links were ambiguous or not clear, or if the URL was really long and it was kind of not really discernible that way. That rule was taken out because putting URLs directly in documents and PowerPoints isn't inherently problematic. Like these AKA links, or if I type Microsoft.com, that's a pretty clear link. But if I do like a very long string in URL, then it gets pretty cumbersome. But yeah, I mean, there's not a way today to check for link names like click here or learn more. But I think that's something that the team has been exploring, but that's certainly feedback we'll pass on.
All right, thanks. And there's one more question. It's from Vanessa. It's if I export a PPT to PDF, will the accessibility content export with it?
Yeah, and I can share that real quick. That's a great question. So let me just clean up my slides a little bit. So I've gone in, and as we did on this, we walked through and improved all the accessibility issues here. So now, yeah, it is pretty easy to export even Word documents or this to PDF. So I'll go to File. Now, I know a lot of folks use print and then save as PDF. We actually don't want to do that route because that today doesn't keep a lot of that accessibility markup that we've added. So I would either do save as or export, create PDF.
Uh-oh, hang on one second. I realized I didn't share the screen. Sorry.
That's okay.
Okay, so I'm going to push the screen now. All right,
sure.
Sorry, go ahead.
So I've gone into PowerPoint again, and I've gone to File. If I can show that again real quick. File, Export, PDF, and then create PDF. And then I can title it. And I want to call out the options here. There's this checkbox for including the document structure tags for accessibility purposes. That's checked by default, but just be aware that that's there, and it's a good thing to validate if you want to output an accessible PDF. Make sure that's checked, and then it is really easy. So then you would just hit publish. So that's a good way to. It's pretty easy and straightforward to make accessible PDFs. From Word, it's the same process. Just make sure you make it accessible through the accessibility checker, and then export it as a PDF as opposed to printing it as a PDF.
Okay.
Great question.
There's quite a few questions. We'll try to get as much as we could. So you're ready for the next one?
Sure.
This is from Jane, and the question is, do you have any guidelines on when to add alt description for an image versus changing to descriptive decorative? And for decorative, would you then exclude these from the slide order?
Sure. That's a good question on PowerPoint too. So with images, I mean, my general rule is if they're conveying content and they're meaningful and someone would gain information from that image, you want to add good alt text to describe it. If the image is not adding a lot of content, such as on this last slide, my image of the woman with the question marks above her head, that one has alt text, but that would actually be okay to mark as decorative. And then in my reading order pane, let me bring that back up. When I mark something as decorative, it automatically gets deselected from the reading order. From the reading order pane, I can also mark stuff as decorative really easily. I just check or uncheck it. So now it's not decorative again, and you'd want to make sure it has alt text in that case. And then if I uncheck it, it marks it as decorative and then hides it from the reading order. Good question.
Okay, cool. Do you have time for a few more?
Sure.
Okay, so this is from David again. In PowerPoint, polished EBC decks and exec decks often have complex visuals with a lot of little pieces like the lines, dots, etc. What is the guidance for alt text, decorative, etc.? Is there a way to group everything together within a slide in a hidden way that can be grouped together with a single description, or other best practices in these cases?
Sure, that's a really good question and something we do actually see a lot. There's lots of scenarios where someone might have really complicated visuals that have lots of objects. Whenever possible, I mean, we recommend simplifying that as much as you can. If you don't need quite so many of the objects, you can hide them, mark them as decorative, but you can group things. That helps a lot. So these slides I have today aren't very complex, so I don't have a great example here. But if I had a really complex slide, I could group the objects together, and then in the reading order pane, they would show in that group. If it's a really complex visual that just has lots of pieces but it's indicating one thing, one approach that I've seen a lot is if you select each of those objects that are conveying one thing, cutting them from the slide and then pasting them as an image, and then giving that image alt text, Because if the goal is for your visual to have just like kind of one key takeaway from it, as much as you can do that, kind of distill it down into one image and give alt text to that. I don't have a great example. Let me see if I can mock one up just really quick here. I'll just add a couple symbols. Dialogue.
I think there was a follow-up to that. So let me keep reading that. The desired outcome is that each line and dot would be considered in and of itself decorative, but the sum of all the little components would be a single visual ID. What a screen reader to give a description for. Any way to achieve this outcome. Yep.
Yeah, and so in what I'm creating right now, let's say that I've just added, I don't know, simple chart, but maybe these triangles are indicating some sort of up and down diagram or a trend or something like that. But each of them is a discrete object. So what I can do is I'll cut them from the slide and then paste them as image. And so now they're still the same visual, but then it's just one object to give alt text.
Yeah, but the only challenge is that, and again, this is coming from David, the only challenge is that if we paste it as image, you lose the ability to animate the complex diagram.
Yeah, I think to be transparent, there's not a perfect answer that I can give today, unfortunately. Whenever possible, make those things as flat as you can. And so if there are things that animate in together, maybe those could be a group. But just wherever possible, think about how you can reduce the number of discrete objects, either by grouping or pasting as image. And I know that's not a great answer, but.
Okay, cool. Thanks, Sean. Hey, a lot of great questions. Thank you. We are right about on time, so I want to wrap this.